This video is sponsored by Squarespace. I'm just kidding. It's not. Also, sorry if you can hear my dad in the background. He's trying to be a famous YouTuber. Oh, I just spilled coffee on me. Okay, so Hoyte van Hoytema, a cinematographer whose work isn't summarized into a few words and whose style can't be condensed into a bag of lookbook tricks. After watching 6 of his 16 films, I was in awe, and yet I was fumbling to try and create a cohesive presentation on what makes a Hoyte van Hoytema film. His style didn't appear revolutionary, and except for a few simple commonalities between his films, they varied quite a bit as far as cinematic approach, which to me felt rather, well, straightforward. So why was I still so enamored? Hoyte's life is not very public, so there's not much to note from that perspective. He was born in Switzerland to Dutch parents, but he feels, quote, adopted by Sweden, having a Swedish wife and daughter, and attributing the importance of his career to Sweden. He applied to the Netherlands Film Academy, but after 2 rejections, he went into different career fields, including carpentry and soap making. But in interviews, Hoyte has reflected on this time, saying that it was really important for him, developing him as an artist. Eventually, he went to a Polish film school, leaving early without a degree, but a notable cinematographer. His initial work included many documentaries, but eventually he was offered a role on a feature film in Norway, where he connected with a Swedish producer, which then landed him a television series and another feature film. And this really was the start of his career. His first internationally recognized film is a horror called Let the Right One In, and it was directed by Thomas Alfred CINE, with whom he actually collaborated again in 2011 on Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. But even before Tinker, there was The Fighter, directed by David O. Russell of American Hustle and Silver Linings Playbook. This film really marked the catapult of his career. And I think the reason for this, aside from the fact that he's an amazing artist, is that it was nominated for Best Picture. So I think that really got his name out there. And after that, it really was downhill from there in the best sense. I mean, listen to this lineup of work. Starting in 2010 with The Fighter, and then there was Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, Her, Interstellar, Spectre, Dunkirk, Ad Astra, and pending Corona, Christopher Nolan's Tenet is supposed to come out. That's a decade-long streak of no duds. Incredible, really. So to start off the conversation about the films that I watched, The Fighter. Shot on the 35mm Anton Penelope, it allowed for a very analog feel with rich magenta skin tones, green shadows, and pleasant grain. They also used outdated Betacams to recreate each boxing match, so it felt like old TV footage. Hoyte stuck with medium shots, medium close-ups, and close-ups pretty much the whole film. Literally, I think I saw maybe 6 establishing shots. An interesting approach. However, what struck me the most was the camera movement. Primarily handheld with a few small dollies, Hoyte created a sense of chaos. He distinctively made full or partial circles around characters and utilized late pans to action or within dialogue. It had a very documentary feel. Now, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. From the get-go, there's a change from the cinematography in The Fighter. All the movement was far smoother, with dolly tracking shots, sliders, and crane work, which allowed for an overall cleaner feel. The framing was inspired by a large format photo book from the 60s called London, City of Any Dream, and accounted for the long lens, voyeuristic approach. Hoyte used wider shots, longer lenses, and dirty frames, frequently shooting through windows. And of course, the beautiful Her. Also inspired by photography, Her took notes from Japanese photographer Rinko Kawauchi, whose work presents everyday life. Hoyte switched to digital for this film, using ARRI Alexas for their latitude in low light. They used 35mm and 50mm Zeiss lenses for intimate handheld moments, and coatingless Cooke lenses for sun flares and a general glow. Hoyte's work on Her presented deeper depth of field as well as shallower depth of field than any of his other work, featuring some intense bokeh and beautiful landscapes. Interstellar. The first of 3 Nolan collaborations, this film was a whole different genre for Hoyte. And yet, despite being a sci-fi-ish movie, Nolan was clear that he wanted it to feel real, accounting for how even the different worlds feel somehow familiar and relatable. In order to accomplish this, Hoyte used what felt like a classical approach to framing and camera movement, only moving in for close-ups when necessary. And of course, being that this was such a different genre, he got to play around with wider landscapes, sweeping drone shots, and worked intensely with the VFX department. Spectre. Another spy movie involving MI6, but with a whole different look than Tinker. Opening with an ambitious oneer, Spectre utilized far wider shots and deeper depth of field than any other Hoyte film so far. Interestingly, this is the only film where Hoyte used notable symmetry and centered framing. And of course, Dunkirk. Despite all odds and the sheer weight of the camera, almost all of this film was shot on IMAX. Hoyte found ways to mount it on his shoulder, strap it to a plane wing, and even custom-designed snorkel lenses to shoot into the cockpit. They braved sands, underwater, boats, changing tides, and temperamental weather. And despite being a war film, Hoyte noted that he and Nolan didn't want to find the most sensational shots. Quote, "We found the most visceral shots. They wanted it to feel real and almost documentary-like." This motivated their approach, especially when it came to almost completely natural lighting, as well as working around the weather, not worrying about continuity between shots. It's no wonder Hoyte was nominated for an Oscar for his cinematography. And so as you can see, there's huge variance within his films, but there were a few key things I found consistent throughout his films. For one thing, with his lighting approaches, he shot very naturally, often putting light sources outside of windows. He almost always had the camera opposite a window, shooting from this side, sort of getting a beautiful glow. Another thing that's consistent is he likes working with film. He will work with digital, but he does note that his love does lie in film. Another note is that he does much of his work in camera. He doesn't like to rely on post, even for films like Interstellar and Dunkirk. As far as camera movement goes, by far his favorite is handheld. He does a few small dollies in key emotional moments, but handheld work is his go-to. He also consistently used eye-level shots. Of course, there are drone shots and slightly lower angles at times, but for the most part, it was all very eye-level, which I thought was a very interesting classical sort of approach to filmmaking. And lastly, probably my favorite aspect of his filmmaking was his perfection of dirty frames. He used it all the time, especially favoring over-the-shoulder shots in dialogue conversations. And yet when I looked at these commonalities, they felt very simple. And I was still confused, why is his work so beautiful? And I think the reason it's so beautiful is because his work is honest. It's not sensational. It's not trying to be anything over the top. He favors medium shot, handheld work at eye level. That's almost the most basic you can get in a sense. But I think that speaks to the beauty and simplicity and really an appreciation on his side for the classical approach to filmmaking.